Coming up, a witch hunt within the United States Navy. A Minnesotan, former Marine, and Navy SEAL sounds off on what he calls election meddling, the moves made behind the scenes that kept him from running for Congress. Welcome to Collin Reports, and I'd like to welcome my guest, Lieutenant Adam Schwarze, formerly a Marine and a Navy SEAL. It's quite the resume we have to start with, but sir, thank you so much for joining me and for that very important service.
Oh, thanks for your time this morning, Liz. I really appreciate you shedding light into the darkness on the story and taking the time to figure things out.
Yeah, sadly, there is so much darkness to get to, but let's start a bit with the light. Tell us about yourself. You are a Bloomington native, I know, a U of M grad, all kinds of ties to the Minnesota area.
Yeah, I'm very proud to say that an American, but also a Minnesota boy, Minnesota man. Born there, I'll die there. I was actually born in Bloomington or St. Paul, but adopted by a family in Bloomington. Both my adopted and my biological family are from Minnesota, so grew up as learned how to skate before I could walk, like good Minnesotans do. Played hockey, lacrosse, soccer in high school. Graduated in 2002. I guess some atmospherics. My story is 9/11 happened during my senior year of high school. I was always compelled for a service that obviously further emboldened my desire. I was in the process of trying to enlist into the Navy on 9/11, but the Navy recruiters shut down for a period of time after 9/11 had happened. So first to contract, walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office, and they, true to the recruiter's words, the Marines are first to fight. And I was on a ship that same year I graduated in 2002 for my first deployment to Iraq. I did all 5 phases of the Operation Iraqi Freedom. Proved myself in combat as a good operator, good shooter, and then was very fortunate to get into this program that the Marines have called Embassy Duty Marine Security Guard, where I was working with the Department of State for about 4 years at our chancelleries and embassies around the world. And that really opened up my aperture as far as foreign policy, diplomatic things, how the world worked in other veins. Really set me up for success later on, because I had some great leaders serving as both the Department of State and then my senior Marines, who submitted me for a meritorious commission program. So the U.S. taxpayer essentially paid for me to go back and get a degree in commission. As you said, I came back home to Minnesota.
And you then are also able to chase that dream and become a Navy SEAL after being, a highly decorated combat veteran with your deployments. I know you deployed 9 times in your career, traveled to 70 countries in all. But talk about that. What was it about service? Why was this the course you wanted to set for your life?
Yeah, again, I can't put my thumb on it. Why? I've always had the desire to serve in the military. But certainly, as I did enlist and then start my travels around. Uh, I never took for granted, one, being adopted and everything that I had from my families, and then the Midwest Minnesota upbringing of our values that were instilled upon me from a young age. Going around and seeing the rest of the world, how the rest of the world doesn't share those values. The rest of the world doesn't have those things that I had just by being a mere American. The really far left, they talk about the one percenters. Everything's like an us versus them and a victim. Well, if you're an American, you're the 1% of the world. So I was really just honored to be an American and go around the world and do these great things on behalf of our country, and then really understand the gratitude I had for my own nation, but to try to work to better these other areas of the world and spread our values, I guess.
And then so ultimately, this storied career you're in the middle of, and it's COVID, and really such a wild and crazy story how your service ends. But take us back. This is April of 2020, and just to remind people listening, people watching, this is right as COVID is sort of taking shape. We don't know too much, even in the spring of 2020. There is some fear, but this is just a crazy story.
Yeah, it is crazy. To backpedal just a little bit. So in 2012, I commissioned, did a couple of deployments with SEAL Team 3 on the West Coast after I completed SEAL training. And then in 2016, I was selected for the special element, naval special warfare undersea that does, near peer competitor things, great power competition. So Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, those are the things that we generally operate against out of this element that was in Hawaii. So 2016, start that. Again, the rest of my career, I was doing very well. Gaining assignments. I was actually at the time of April of 2020, the in-water mission commander for this very big Super Bowl event operation. But we've been working very hard, diving every day. Certainly since the beginning of that new year, like to include New Year's Eve, New Year's Day diving, again, for this very important mission. April 9th, our power goes out where we live. We lived my partner and I on a military base on a boat, actually. I don't know how familiar you are with boats or been on a cruise, but they don't have power. They don't have AC. So
Pretty
we
hot.
had no,
Yeah.
you get very hot. Yeah, you nailed it. So over 100 degrees in my house. Got permission from my boss. I think it was the first time I'd have off. It was Easter. So we go to the neighboring island of Kauai in Hawaii. Same state, different island, different world. Looking back now, it's everybody's like things that make sense with policies. But even back then, there's some things that just didn't make sense. Like Hawaii closed down the beaches. They closed down hiking trails to go get like vitamin D and sunlight up in like trails, closed down tennis courts. I don't know if you're familiar with the game of tennis, but you're like 30 yards away hitting a ball back and forth. They shut all that down, put chains on the tennis courts, give people tickets if they went to the beach. But they never closed down like the J.C. Penney's and the TJ Maxx's, things that just didn't make sense, right? So just the draconian, policies in place. And again, we got to call a spade a spade. I never got into politics. I don't even think politically, but that was all the Democrats. It was Democrats roll every part of government in Hawaii. It was a unipolar shift of all these different things that were happening. But April 10th, then we arrive in Kauai. We get apprehended at a checkpoint where there's National Guard and police, and we're informed that, hey, you're here like, illegally, you can't be a tourist. You need to go quarantine. I'm like, I didn't get in arguments because, I love police officers, but said, hey, we're just trying to get groceries, and then we're going to bed down for 4 days and then leave. They're like, nope, you got to figure it out, get groceries delivered or find another way to get food. Have friends and family to drop them off. No, we don't have connections here. What do you want us to do? They said, figure it out. So we leave the checkpoint and, trying to, follow through with the instructions of the police officers. But again, it's COVID. So they're not going to deliver groceries during COVID. That doesn't make sense. We're not going to go to a restaurant and actually, put people in jeopardy. So we did, the best option, which was we stopped at a grocery store legitimately directly across from our Airbnb. And Liz, I kid you not, when we came out of the grocery store, they took us down like we were Al Capone. They had 5 cop cars. It's security on the scene. 10 police officers were apprehended, were booked. And at that point, I said, hey, just letting you guys know, I'm actually in the military. These things, I don't have to abide by all these quarantine things. I'm a federally exempt employee.
And this is a trip that you also sought approval for, and you received approval for as well. And I laugh now because there's so much known now, more than 3 years later. But these mug shots are plastered all over the news. You're sort of public enemy number one for going to the grocery store.
Yeah, that's essentially how my career was ended. Is I got groceries, and then one was arrested by the Kauai police, which I think that was just an innocent uh, accident. But then when I was like, hey, I'm in the military, I'm exempt. And then also look here, the government, you're the governor of Hawaii, which supersedes obviously the governor the island of Kauai, getting groceries is exempt. Well, the problem was the prosecutor was running for office as a Democrat, and he released our mugshots and put this fake story out to the press that, my partner and I were tourists that were, there to try to harm people and put, citizens of Hawaii's health in jeopardy, which is just couldn't be farther from the truth. And it is, I think, kind of ironic and sad that I spent my whole life as really a model citizen trying to defend and support America to be then stabbed in the back by government. And then, secondly, cast aside by the SEALs and my own brothers because they took a political out.
And that stab in the back continues, Lieutenant Schwarze, with this kangaroo court. I think we can call it that. That plays out after all of this. But tell us about that.
Yeah, so at that point, I've been in about 18 years, and I was very saddened to, the lack of leadership, both in the government side, of Hawaii, and then certainly the lack of leadership within the military. It just politics had been corrupting the military. I mean, if you look now, how many thousands of special operations people we kicked out because they didn't take the experimental COVID shot, but now we're investing in the drag queens for the recruiting void that we're having. Like the solutions to these problems aren't matching what they need to be filled, which is really a leadership void, frankly. That's why they're having a recruiting problem. But I attempted to resign my commission, which at 18 years is a pretty big deal, because at 20 years you get pension, life benefits, disability, all those things. I tried to surrender that. My chain of command denied my resignation. They said, "Hey, just be a good soldier. See you on their way out. You've been a wonderful career. Just go get your medical stuff and just suck it up and do your 20." So I said, Roger that. I carried on. At this point, I submitted a request to run for office. And why I did that is because, I just had my life permanently altered now because of poor leadership within the government and the Navy. And then the further context is, being a Minnesota boy, immediately after my life was altered by COVID, the George Floyd thing happened back home in Minnesota. And I
Yeah,
watched.
and I just wanted to touch on that for a minute here, to bring this in, talk about that lack of leadership. You sort of see that play out in Minnesota a bit with the riots and such. And so this is when you're interested in Minnesota's third congressional district. But yeah, talk more about that and why you wanted to run in the midterms last year.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I just had my own life impacted by poor leadership in government and in the military, and then immediately following, I see this national, story unfold. And again, I'm both empathetic to, the COVID wasn't new at the time, and I'm empathetic to even, George Floyd and his family. Like I get that, but the lack of leadership surrounding that, we had a police precinct burned to the ground in 4 days of riots, and the governor of Minnesota did nothing. And he's a National Guard military man. So for the context, I'm sure he should be looking at the situation just as I was. We had a police precinct that's like essentially a U.S. base on U.S. soil that was just given up to the masses to be burned to the ground. For 4 days, there wasn't a call made on what to do, how to stop this. The congressman, representing the third district, my hometown, later threw the police under the bus and tried to vote to repeal qualified immunity for police officers.
And this is
Just
Dean Phillips.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Again, just the lack of leadership to say, hey, this is a problem. It is a problem. We need to have police reform. I get that. I can be on board. We should have some really hard conversations about what police reform looks like. But then when you look to, the fifth congressional district in Minneapolis, that Minneapolis got within a few percentage points of disbanding and defunding their entire police force. Like, the lunacy of that is really just emblematic, like, of the lack of leaders in our government right now.
So you have this heart for service. You want to run for Congress, and you don't really know at the time what's going on behind the scenes, but there's clearly some large moves being made to prevent you from doing so, from running as a Republican.
Yep, it is very sad. And again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the story gets really crazy at this point, because after all the charges in Kauai were dismissed, completely cleared of all civilian things, I lost my orders to the Central Intelligence Agency. I was supposed to do my last three orders, working with the CIA. I was going to retire from the military and just continue to do things behind the scenes. Those orders were taken, and then I'm like, hey, I need to insert myself in this problem set. That's what I've done my whole life. Here's a problem. I insert myself. I try to provide corrective action and leadership. I submitted a request to the Secretary of the Navy, which is the first step in trying to run for office. It was crafted with some lawyers, but frankly, we knew there was a 0 to 0% chance that request was going to get approved. For those of your smart viewers who may not know, the Secretary of the Navy, he oversees the Navy, but he's really a cabinet appointee. President Biden appoints the Secretary of the Navy. So we knew that request was going to go nowhere. But what also is really critical is 270 days. So your last 9 months of service, you can file what's called a notification to serve. That so you're essentially you're forming somebody, not a secretary, but somebody else in your chain of command, that this is your intention, and that's not unprecedented. During the Trump administration, we had a different special operations Green Beret. He was running as a Democrat. The only difference was he was not stymied from being able to start a committee. And so I submitted that notification up to my chain of command. And at the meantime, I'm still trying to separate early from the military, because my whole philosophy is we need to decouple our politics and our military. We need to decouple government and schools, decouple the politicization of the medical field. Like, just get government and politics out of the thing so people can go back to living their lives like it was when I grew up in Minnesota. We didn't have politics seeping into the classroom and all these weird agendas. That's my whole reason why I wanted to run. So Senator Kramer then got involved. Senator Kramer was, really the standard bearer of, hey, this guy tried to resign his commission. He said no. Now he's trying to retire early. By the way, this early retirement will save taxpayers millions of dollars in the long run of, my early retirement. Naval Special Warfare Undersea. You've had this guy for an extra 2 years, one of 8 dudes who does this very special, important mission. You don't get another, Lieutenant Schwarze until he's off your rosters. They're just keeping me for the sake of keeping me. And it would have served me as well. But most importantly, for democracy, I wouldn't have been in the military then. But the Secretary of the Navy stuffed that request to retire. They came after me and said that my notification was null and void. And on April of 3 days before April 1st of 2022, 3 days before I was supposed to get my what's called a DD 214. Essentially, it's like a document that says your time of service is complete. You've served honorably. These are all the things you've done. They recalled me back to Hawaii, where I was formerly stationed, and they had what you alluded to earlier, this kangaroo court with all these falsified documents.
It's crazy. So they drag their feet. It takes you years to retire. Essentially, we know now that it was Tom Wheeler, a former U.S. Navy submarine officer, who ran against Dean Phillips. Phillips won that slot 60 to 40% in the midterm. But meanwhile, this is something that's all put on your plate. They try to take your pension away. Is that right? They take your Trident.
Yeah, so once they recalled me, then they have to deal with why they recalled me. So in the military, it's called non-judicial punishment, and that's important for 2 reasons. One, there was no justice, but there also wasn't like a judicial process. Essentially, it's me going before the military, and when you sign up for the military, you sacrifice a lot of your rights, but essentially I'm just standing there, and they're reading off all these falsified documents from the command investigation, which is a big deal. They also stole about a year's long of my vacation, about 30 days, which is also illegal. In order to bring me back, that's how they stole my vacation. But then after that, the Navy canceled my retirement orders. So because I actually had orders to separate from the military, they used this kangaroo court then to nullify my retirement separation, which, if anybody who's ever served in the military, it just doesn't make sense, because I'd served over 20 years at that point. I had no time commitment. I wasn't serving any kind of operational capacity. So everybody, the U.S. taxpayer essentially paid for an extra 2.5 years for me to serve, even though I wasn't providing value to national security. I was taking a spot so somebody else could do my job. It just didn't make sense, right? But then this is where the Navy kind of screwed up, because all these documents were getting sent up to the Secretary of the Navy's office to get me out. Even after the kangaroo court, everybody said, okay, now we had this kangaroo court, get him out now. And they refused to get me out. So what they had to do after that was have a reason to keep me in past my 20-year mark. And they overplayed their hand, frankly, because they had to have what's called a board of inquiry. It's a trial. And again, it's not a perfect, process like you have in a civilian side, where you have judges and jurors and everything like that. No, you have 3 senior high-ranking military officers who 99% of the time, they just go with the chain of command. They're beholden to the Secretary of the Navy as well, ultimately. But they did not select ones that were going to sacrifice their own morals, because they gave me a fair trial wherein, they said I violated all these articles of conduct, violations of the Hatch Act, all these things. And so they sifted through these thousands of pages of documents, videos from on the ground, when I was in Minnesota networking, preparing. And by the way, I never was able to declare as a candidate in Minnesota.
Right.
Um, and then they unanimously found that all of those things were not true, completely untrue, to the point where, as a civilian, if you go to trial, it's like the burden of proof. In the military, it's a lesser qualification. It's called the preponderance of evidence. So it's like, hey, we found some evidence. Maybe he did these things. No, they said no. Unanimously, the entire panel said there is no preponderance, no basis for any of these things. But they still
But
didn't let me out right away.
well, I was going to say, and
They,
even in all of this too, they're searching your background, and it seems to me they can't find absolutely anything at all.
yeah.
In fact, you have people coming to your defense. It sounds like in great numbers, and some people that actually matter. That spoke on your behalf.
Yeah, I was very blessed to be supported by people in Minnesota who were taking note. So essentially, hundreds of people in Minnesota who were in the district I was going to run it. They all wrote statements voluntarily. By the way, like you know over 50 like field grade officers from all branches of service said like, hey, we're seeing Lieutenant Schwarze. He's never over the line on these things. Lawyers were saying like, hey, I'm advising him. I've told him to do these things. He's on the right side of this. I did have a few character witnesses come into the board, but yeah, I swore, on the Bible, had sworn statements that essentially everything I did was right. I'm happy to make those statements anytime. Meanwhile, while I'm swearing statements that are all factually true, the Navy, there's a command investigation, and then statements from headquarters Navy, numerous false official statements, to including, I mean, things that don't even make sense, like denying I was in combat. I have like multiple awards and valor that are on my official records, saying I never deployed, saying I was a substandard officer while I was at this special element. But meanwhile, I have like, unique awards that were given to me months previous to the same gentleman that then bottom line thinks that I didn't get awards. All my fitness reports, all my like reviews, essentially since I've been in the military, I've been a number one performer my entire time in the military. Saying these things just didn't make sense because it's all very easy to dispute them with the records. And again, they overplayed their hand, frankly. I think they're counting on their selected jurors, those senior ranking military officers, to just kind of throw me onto the bus. I really thank God they didn't. But even in the trial itself, they broke the law because they gave me as my defense lawyer a brand new person who never done one of these trials before. He'd been in the Navy 2 years. Meanwhile, they gave the prosecutors like three senior like naval investigators and prosecutors. So it's like I have the guy on one side who's never done this before versus like a team of, they try to stack the deck. And then the legal part was we found somebody who had done this before, a colonel in the Air Force, and you're allowed to get your own counsel, just like you're allowed to as a civilian. And then the Navy's like, yeah, we're not going to let you get counsel. We're giving you this guy who's never done one of these trials before. Luckily, truth prevailed. And then, finally, March of this year, after the trial's over, during which, yeah, they took my trident for the trial. So as an, I'm not even, I'm a former Navy SEAL, but I didn't retire with my trident because they took it again without any sort of due process in a completely unprecedented ways. Like in the SEAL community, we do take people's tridents every now and then. Before that happens, there's a trident review board. There's a process. They didn't give me a process. They just took it. That's unprecedented. During the time when I got recalled back to Hawaii from Minnesota, they put me in confinement. That is also unprecedented. We've never had a Navy SEAL officer get put in confinement. Back to the trident thing, we have guys, SEALs do good things and bad things like everybody else in society. We've had SEALs that like raped children in Hawaii. We have SEALs that committed murder in California. You know what we did? We charged them with child molestation. We charged them with murder in California. We put them in jail, but we didn't take their trident. I mean, this was completely just from top down sham to one, pull me out so I couldn't, run for the election, and then completely discredit my story, discredit my service, and then ruin my reputation. So once I got out, people would be like, oh, he's a washed up, not even a SEAL, all these terrible things. They didn't think thank God the board and the trial came out the way it is, because now I can say, hey, you had your trial. The Secretary of the Navy had his trial. And then after the trial, he just says, oh, well, I don't really know the particulars of all those false official statements you're claiming I made, but you still violated Hatch Act. Well, no, you're violating the Hatch Act because you didn't let me out. That was really telling when Senator Kramer's like, you made a political decision against the grain of everybody who's in the uniform military that doesn't make sense. The Secretary of the Navy didn't have any answer for that because it didn't make sense. It was meddling. And then the Secretary of the Navy said, well, I don't know about all those things, but he was violating the Hatch Act. Well, the whole point of the Hatch Act, for people who don't know, is to keep exactly what the Secretary of the Navy did, to keep people who are senior members in government from meddling in politics and going against, the military. And that's what he did. So it's ironic that he would, allegate that again after his own trial.
And Alpha News recently featured a story about that, and I should say too, this is why you're now free to talk about this, as it's now in the past, from March when this finally comes to an end for you. But Senator Kramer at that time said you pulled his trident and then prevented him from retiring on time. You went after this decorated hero with a veracity that made my staff, including a commander in the military, reach out to him to check his well-being and reach out to the Navy to make sure they were looking out for his well-being. And he also said, is there a standard where Navy lawyers are allowed to just absolutely trash a guy's reputation, create misstatements, factually untrue statements about his career and his claims? I know that the senator has gone to bat for you a few different times, but I guess that is the question now. How are you doing? And you've focused on this, wanting to decouple the government, because I think we're all living the consequences, frankly, of the government being involved in so many aspects of our lives.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. That's a great question. Now I am out as of 1 March, but certainly I am more emboldened than ever to, one, spread this message because, there's been a lot of talk, the dead horse has been beaten so many times about stolen elections and, the 2020, but even the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton saying the election was stolen. Everybody loves to say that, but there's never a lot of evidence, right? And I'm not stating that. This is not a stolen election. This was killing the baby in the crib. I never was able to get out and run for office because of very, very concerted political corruption, meddling, oppression. But the good news is, unlike just stating that to get viewership, this is all documented, and the unprecedented actions that happened in this case. I think a very reasonable and prudent person can just look at this common sense, wait, we took his trident without a process. He was held captive, literally in prison, but that's never happened before. How is there false official statements made at so many different levels that weren't, corrupted? There's a lot of things that just don't make sense about this. But, moving forward, now that I'm out besides trying to, get this message forward, and thank you and your team at Alpha News for giving me the opportunity to shed this light, because this is the first time I've spoken about this in a polished news source. As I've started a nonprofit defending freedom and democracy, and frankly, the whole point of that is to serve the people of America. Government is really insidiously impacting everybody and corrupting, all these different capacities of life that it shouldn't. School, medical field, the military, certainly, as I've lived firsthand now. We just need to get it back and, get government to serve the people again in a common sense way. And, I think that's a bipartisan problem, frankly. I think that there's a lot of people on all the parts of the spectrum who are just unhappy with, their service that they should be receiving from government, but they're not. And it really boils down to a lack of leadership in government. The George Floyd thing is a great vignette to look at the failed leadership in Minnesota, but really that problem goes all the way up. So that's what I'm trying to fight right now. It's just to get good leaders, good people, men and women who are vetted, who have demonstrated leadership into politics.
And it's so frustrating to hear from someone like you. You dedicate your life to service and you're developed into this leader. And then it's like all of these forces come together to keep you, from holding a position to make some of these changes. I think it's so eye-opening. And frankly, I know your story's been out there for a little bit, but it's been buried. I mean, the focus on the news is anything but a story like yours.
Yeah, I don't know why it's taken a month, but I appreciate your team giving me an opportunity to bring it forward. I hope that it continues to gain traction. And really, my whole goal is that people just know the truth. The truth is that we did have meddling in a federal election, and that should scare people. People who, of all political spectrums, of all backgrounds, that's how governments are overthrown, and there's civil war because of the government meddling in the military to turn elections. And that's a clear case of what happened here. It's really scary. I would never have believed it just a few years ago. It's crazy. I talked to all my SEAL and Marine brothers now that I'm out and that I'm telling them the story, because I really didn't talk about this when it was all happening. I was just dealing with it, and they're all take the same position, like, oh my God, this happened. I would never expected this. We need to get this this light on what happened out there to the public, because people need to know what happened.
And so talk about that. How can people help? How can they follow along?
Yeah, thanks. So again, we just started at the nonprofit Defending Freedom and Democracy. There is a website started 1 March. That's what I'm doing right now is trying to go on programs like yours and just spread the message of the problem set is a failure of leadership in government, and the solution is getting on board to help push back against the dark money, the special interest groups. Like this is a nonprofit that's really going to help common sense leaders get into government because of the lack of leadership problem.
Well, Lieutenant Adam Schwarze, we're certainly sorry for all you've been dealing with these last few years. We commend you, though, for your bravery that continues to come forward and share your story. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate your time today.
And that will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.